This movie's a good reminder that I need to get my studded tires put on for the season. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. As part of my 2020 13 Nights of Halloween series, today I'm going to be talking about the 1990 psychological thriller, Misery. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Misery stars Kathy Bates and James Caan and was directed by Rob Reiner. Based on Stephen King's 1987 novel of the same name, it tells the story of author Paul Sheldon, played by James Caan, who's held captive by his unstable, self-proclaimed #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, played by Kathy Bates. Happy Halloween, everybody! We've reached the 13th review of this year's 13 Nights of Halloween, so I figured we would end on one of my favorite Stephen King movies. At this point, I think you guys know how much I love Stephen King, but you also know that I'm pretty consistently underwhelmed by the film adaptations of his novels. Adaptations of his short stories and novellas are almost always great, but the novels often struggle when making the jump to film. There's just so much to King's books, and it seems like filmmakers often have a hard time deciding what elements of the story should make the cut when converting. The Shining's an exception to this unwritten novel adaptation rule, but Kubrick changed so much that it's really only a ghost of the original story. Misery's another exception, and perhaps a better example because it's a far more accurate adaptation. Misery was the 6th Stephen King novel that I ever read. I know it's kind of weird that I kept track of that, but whatever. I began my journey down that horrific rabbit hole with Cujo. After that, I was hooked, and followed up with Christine, Pet Sematary, The Shining, It, Carrie, and Misery, all in quick succession. While extremely interesting and entertaining, supernatural stories don't typically scare me all that much. Realistic horror, on the other hand, sometimes gets under my skin a bit more. With the exception of Cujo, all of the other King novels I had read prior to Misery had been very supernatural heavy. Even Cujo was slightly outrageous and exaggerated regarding the manifestation of rabies. But Misery's different. Misery could happen. Misery is real. So Misery's scary in a very different way. The central plot here is remarkably simple, but I think that works to the story's advantage, and is one of the reasons it's among the best King novel adaptations. We've got a handful of minor side characters, but really, this is a 2-character story. Aside from a few glimpses at the outside world, this movie takes place in a single location, and mostly just one room of that location. And right from the get-go, we've got an unequal balance of power between our 2 confined characters. One is mostly helpless, almost entirely dependent on the other, and so all of these things work to set up a premise rife with dramatic and thrilling potential. And thrilling is exactly what this film is. It's incredibly suspenseful and expertly builds its tension, not only within specific sequences, but also across the entirety of the movie. Despite taking place in only a few rooms, and mostly focusing in on only 2 characters, it's pretty exhilarating. The movie's full of very precisely edited sequences that ramp up the tension and excitement. There are so many moments where we're hopeful that Paul's gonna escape or be rescued, and just as many where we're fearful that he's gonna get caught and punished for his actions. And Annie Wilkes is such an unpredictable character that it gets to the point where you're tense even in calm scenes where nothing ends up happening. As is the case in nearly every Stephen King story, the characters are incredibly important here. The scenario's chilling, but it wouldn't have been nearly as effective without compelling characters. And these particular characters make the jump from page to screen remarkably well, thanks to some superb performances. Paul Sheldon is yet another in the long list of author characters in Stephen King stories. This character in particular was semi-autobiographical for King, and so Paul's not only a believable, fleshed-out protagonist, but he's one that's really easy to root for. I watched this movie for the first time right after reading the book, and I'll admit that I wasn't a huge fan of this film version of Paul. James Caan did a fine job, but he wasn't the Paul Sheldon I pictured in my mind while reading the book. Over the years, though, I've grown to really like Caan's interpretation of the character. His frustration and agony are palpable, but he also provides a surprising amount of levity to the film as well, with his sarcasm and assortment of entertaining facial expressions when reacting to Annie's odd behavior. Paul Sheldon might be the protagonist, but it's Annie Wilkes who's the real star of the show here. She's an absolutely fascinating character, situated at the dangerous crossroads of severe mental illness and extreme obsessive fanaticism. The first time I saw this movie, I had no disappointment with the casting of Kathy Bates. She is Annie Wilkes. She's exactly what I envisioned while reading the book, and I truly can't imagine anybody else in the role. She perfectly encapsulates the psychotic bipolar insanity of Annie, taking us from her manic highs to her depressive lows and everything in between. Her transformation from sweet savior to sadomasochistic monster is incredible and only further heightens the fear and tension in this movie. The performances, especially that of Kathy Bates, are the major standout aspect of this movie, but this is just an all-around well-made film. Everything works in concert to heighten that tension I mentioned earlier. The editing, the lighting, the cinematography. It's remarkable how much character information was conveyed in this movie just by the framing of shots or the use of different lenses. Small touches like that are strewn throughout this movie, and you don't really notice them unless you're looking for them, but they're extremely effective at getting things across to the audience, even subconsciously. There are some changes between the book and the movie, most notably involving the hobbling scene and the climax, but I would still argue that this is probably the most faithful Stephen King novel adaptation put to film. And I gotta admit, every time I drive the snowy roads of Maine and my tires slip a little bit, I can't help but think about this story. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 is Kathy Bates. I mean, the character of Annie Wilkes is fascinating and interesting in herself, but Kathy Bates is able to capture all that anguish and craziness and bring it to the screen. Bates won the Oscar for Best Actress for this performance, and deservedly so. She's superb here. She's sweet and terrifying, expertly navigating the wildly ranging emotions of this character, while also bringing a good deal of dark humor and levity to the film. She's absolutely perfect for the role, and really gives it her all, delivering one of my all-time favorite performances in any movie. The second pro is the tension. This story is simple, but sometimes the most simple ones are the most effective, and that's definitely the case here. Everything about this movie works in tandem to create a perpetually tense atmosphere. The plot's an important component of this, since it sets Paul up as an incredibly vulnerable character trapped in a confined space with an unpredictable and increasingly more dangerous superfan. But everything else only enhances that tension. The incredible performances, the music, the lighting, the shot composition and editing, all of it works to make the situation feel more dire by the minute, leaving us in a constant state of anxiety and holding our breath for almost an hour and a half. On the con side, I really don't have any major issues, so it just comes down to minor nitpicks for me. A couple of the side characters have some plot threads that are left unresolved, but they're certainly not the main focus of the movie, so I can understand not devoting extra time to wrapping up their stories. And the score is a little hit or miss for me. I like it for the most part, but there are a few scenes where it stands out negatively, either because it's mixed too loudly or because it contrasts too much with what's happening in the story. But like I said, these are just super minor nitpicks that don't really affect my enjoyment of the movie at all. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Misery or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Misery 5 out of 5 paws. This is one of my favorite Stephen King movies, and one of my favorite thrillers in general. It's a really tense story of non-supernatural horror, and features some fantastic performances and a surprising amount of suspense. I would recommend Misery to people who are interested in a suspenseful thriller. This is one of those examples of real horror that I think will resonate with just about anybody because of how plausible the scenario is. Fans of strong performances in horror will love Kathy Bates here, and I think both people who've read the book and those who haven't will be impressed by the excellent portrayal of possibly Stephen King's most iconic and memorable human villain. If you liked Misery, I would recommend Rear Window. It's a very suspenseful mystery thriller directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and also features an immobilized and vulnerable main protagonist. If you want another psychological horror featuring an author as the main character, you should check out The Shining. It has a bit of a supernatural touch to it, but features the other big memorable performance in a Stephen King movie. And if you really like Kathy Bates' performance here, you've definitely gotta watch Dolores Claiborne. It's a really underseen and underrated Stephen King movie and features another phenomenal Kathy Bates performance. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Misery? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite performance in a horror movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.